Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Zession today. If you are new here, we are so excited that you are here with us. My name is Mandy Rourke, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in Austin, Texas. I have a private practice here, and I am also one of the co-founders of Zesho.
I'm Sapna Srivastav, the other co-founder of Zesho, and we're welcoming you to Zessions. Zessions are conversations among clinicians. We talk about topics typically addressed in the mental health world and helping to share the perspective of clinicians who support clients daily.
Yes, and today we are so excited to have you, Julie. Julie is a licensed professional counselor or an LPC in Austin, Texas as well. And she is a partner with Zesho and is with us today to talk about a topic we're all really excited to dive into, which is what support can look like for individuals who identify as autistic. And just before Julie jumps in to do her introduction, I remember when we first met, this was something that you were just really passionate about, and it just created that same passion within me to learn more and really dive in. So just so excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today.
Oh, good. No, I love that. Before I kind of talk about my practice and what I do, I was thinking earlier, I've worked with people on the autism spectrum for 16 years now, which is wild to think about. It's something that I'm super passionate about, something that I love, something I've loved for a really long time. I do have a private practice here, Violet Crown Therapy, and I work with teenagers, adults. I've done family work in the past, but I don't do that as much. I've also worked with relationships, and autism, shows up a lot in various capacities. So that's definitely one of my specialties, working with teens, and then working with people who identify as LGBTQ in some capacity. And a lot of times, like autism and trans identities can intertwine. So I'm super stoked to be talking about it today.
Well, tell us a little more about what
Yeah,
I blanked. I'm sorry.
you're good.
That's okay. That's okay. Right as you blinked, I thought of something that I would also like to add. So that's
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
I can also
Okay. Yeah.
say.
Do you want to just start with that? And so then they can take out this chunk. We'll do another pause and then they can take out this chunk and then you can just add on to whatever
Mhm.
like the rest of your intro. And then I can
Perfect.
or Mandy can go into what
Yep.
was next.
No,
I think
that's
that's why I
Perfect.
paused just because like, did we cover everything that you wanted to cover for your
yes.
intro or are we diving right in?
Sure.
Oh,
No,
good.
I hear you. I hear you.
Okay, so
Um,
pause real fast and then go back in whenever you're ready.
okay, perfect. Something I do want to name that I think is important is that in talking about autism and talking about trans identities, anything that we cover today, I want to be clear that I'm not talking for these communities. I'm not part of the autism community. I'm not a trans person. So this is coming from research. This is coming from books. This is coming from supporting clients. And so this is just my perspective. I don't ever want to speak for any other identity.
Yeah, we appreciate that. And you making that really overt as well. That's really important in our world as well. And so we've touched on this a little bit already, but what makes this topic of supporting individuals who identify as autistic, what makes this topic so important for us to discuss today?
Oh gosh. I feel like, so many things. How do I even answer that? I think the first thing that comes to mind is there's so many stereotypes about what it means to be autistic. I live, and part of me lives in a little bit of a bubble of supporting people on the spectrum. And I also have to recognize like there's still beliefs that, thanks to movies like Rain Man, for example, there are beliefs, that people, you know, are people who are autistic, act and behave in certain ways. And that's absolutely not true. Um, and it can be overlooked a lot. Autism is becoming increasingly more diagnosed, and there's different research that's going out about what traits of autism people can have. And I think if we're not aware of what that looks like or what people are needing, we can do a lot of damage, and we can end up dismissing people's experiences wildly, and I don't know, it just feels so unfair.
Definitely. And I think that we always kind of do this with our sessions, is starting off with just defining this too. And so for me, how would you explain what being on the spectrum or even just autism, like what it is to a client? Because I think, going back to what you're just saying, some people have that snap assumption of like, oh, it must mean Rain Man. Unfortunately, I think that's where the media has come in around that. But also, like, it sounds like you're really expanding that for clients too. So how would you explain it?
Totally. So at the core of it, autism is a developmental condition. And if someone's autistic, they will have challenges with social communication in some capacity. That can be, and it can also look different for every single person, but sometimes it can be, challenging to look someone in the eye. It can be difficult to have like a back and forth typical conversation. There are thousands of unspoken like social rules that a neurotypical person is aware of, but someone with autism may not be aware of. So they might say something that's can be perceived as offensive, totally unintentionally. There can also be like restricted interests or repeated patterns of behavior. So again, this might look different for everyone, but sometimes people who are autistic might rock their body back and forth. I've worked with people who have like kind of, I don't know, did this with their hands. I don't know what to call this. Or I knew someone else said she would flutter her fingers. Those can be ways to self-soothe. They're called stimming, self-stimulatory behavior. And so that, again, if for a neurotypical person, might perceive that as weird or uncommon, but that's just how someone, who's autistic might self-soothe. And it can also look like, having set routines, like major rigidity in things, whether that's routines in food someone eats, whether it's sensory sensitivities and they can only eat certain foods, or routines and how they get to school or work or anything like that. And kind of the beautiful and also tricky thing with autism is that someone might have all of those challenges. Someone might have none. They can look like so many different things, but at the core, that's how I would explain it to somebody.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because we have talked about like the whole the huge spectrum that is autism and how it's like continued to expand, it sounds like, kind of as the DSM has progressed and just more research has come out. And so I appreciate kind of you laying out kind of some of the core pieces and also emphasizing it can look so different, like any diagnosis, any type of experience for anyone. Really, it can look so different for each person. And so in your work with people who are autistic, what are some of the struggles that you observe kind of that they deal with, and especially in dealing with kind of their support system as well?
Totally. So I've got different examples, and these are really specific. So I'm going to give specific examples and try and, expand. But years ago, I worked with someone, he was a college age student, autistic, and trying to connect with peers. That was super, super hard. So I guess that's kind of like a broad, peer connections. And, this particular person I have in mind at his college campus, trying to make a connection with a peer, and followed somebody into the bathroom to keep talking to them, and to like the opposite gender bathroom. And so that for the other person was a huge lack of safety. Whereas for him, he was like, well, I'm trying to connect with somebody. And so that can be really challenging. Or I've worked with other people who in an attempt to connect with people will text them repeatedly. Hey, how are you? Hi, did you get my text? Why aren't you responding? Things like that, which can feel really alarming. And so that's just super hard of, well, wait, you said to connect with someone, I'm connecting with them, but they're not responding. How do I do that? I read a book years ago called Look Me in the Eye by John Elder Robison. And he's autistic, and he was diagnosed in his late 30s. And so he talked about, again, talking about unspoken social norms. He went up to someone and was like, oh, you look like hi, how are you? You look like you've gained weight. Have you gained weight? Which was an immediate observation. But again, for someone who's neurotypical, that's so offensive. Like, how dare you comment on my body, especially pertaining to weight? So that can be very challenging. In relationships, if there's a neurotypical partner and an autistic partner, again, and this is so specific to different people's needs, but if someone's really rigid, I have to watch the news at this time. I have to shower at this time, or you're doing this the wrong way. That can create, I don't know, just tension between people of just why do you have to do it that way? What's going on? And so in that, I mean, that's in someone's personal life, let alone if you're thinking about school, if you're thinking about work, if you're thinking like, about that, there's also, do people want to share with teachers, employers, with friends that they're autistic? It's totally up to them. And also if there's challenges that come with it, it's like, and it's such a slippery slope. It's like, if you name that, will you get the support that you need? Or will you be dismissed and then treated differently? And so there's a lot of challenges that can go into that, unfortunately.
Well, also like what you're talking about when it comes to relationships, I'm thinking of couples that I've supported where one maybe we could say was neurotypical and the other may not identify as autistic because they're an adult and but there's almost like a hypothesis that has been formed in the relationship about their differences. And one thing I remember reading about, and I was curious of your take on this, was like thought mapping. Have you heard of this term before?
It sounds familiar, but
it was just a way of kind of describing like the challenge that someone who is autistic can have when trying to understand what someone like their partner is thinking or feeling in a moment. And I've noticed that in the kind of the example I'm thinking of, there's a lot of like hurt feelings that can happen from someone who's like, why, like I'm communicating to you and I'm not getting this empathy or this remorse based on what I'm saying that I'm thinking or feeling. And the response is not harsh. It's almost more of like, it's hard for there to be like a clear perspective of what that other person is saying. And so I think that's why they're using like thought mapping. Like it can be challenging to be like, well, this is how I process this, but you're telling me you process this. Like, how do I reconcile those differences?
Totally. That example makes me think of a book called Journal of Best Practices. I think the author's name is David Finch. I'm not positive with that. But in that book, David Finch, if that's his name, I'm pretty sure it is someone who's married to a speech therapist. And so in their adult married lives, she started picking up on different tendencies and advocated for him to get tested for autism, and he has it. And so he kept a journal of best practices. Kind of, it makes me think a little bit of thought mapping of like, an example that always comes to mind is like, oh, if there's a song playing on the radio and my wife is singing, don't change the station, that means she likes it. And like that, there can be a perceived lack of empathy of like, exactly like what you were just saying, Mandy, of like, oh, how you feel this way. This is how I'm processing this. How do we not have such a disconnect here? And that's so challenging.
Yeah, that's it sounds like a pretty common thing. It's challenging for neurotypical people oftentimes.
Yes.
Let alone people who are neurodivergent. And so I love that though. I love that example of like, make note of when your wife
Yeah.
is singing along, that's a positive thing, and let's let her do that. And it's like you have to make special note of those things. And so that kind of actually is a good segue into my next question of kind of given some of these challenges that you mentioned, and others for that matter, what are some tips you might share for people who are partners of someone who has autism, or family members or friends, to kind of help support those relationships, or help develop those friendships or relationships even? We'll start with that. I also want to ask about school and work systems if you have
Sure, sure.
too, but we'll start there.
I think, and I mean, this is just how I learn. So this is kind of like do with this what you will type of thing, but there are so many fantastic resources that exist. The first thing that comes to mind is a Netflix series, Love on the Spectrum. And so there's literally a coach, an autism and relationship, oh my gosh, relationship specialist that supports autistic individuals with dating. And something, I'm going to go on a little bit of a side note tangent, and then I'll come back to your question. But it's people with varying needs on the spectrum. And kind of on that note, something in the history of autism, there has been a lot of functioning labels. This person's low functioning, or people might be like, oh, I've got autism, but I'm high functioning. And there's a huge need to get away from that, because there is, that just categorizes people. And again, it kind of minimizes their humanity, and looks at them based on what their life skills look like. And so the reason I bring that up is because in Love on the Spectrum, there are people with a variety of needs. Some people who will be able to live on their own, some people who won't. And just kind of, I like that it highlights that, and kind of everyday needs, everyday struggles, everyday wants for connection. And so I think, watching things like Love on the Spectrum, there are fantastic books out there. Anything by Temple Grandin, I think, is wonderful. She's an autistic scientist who has been very transparent in her books and her writing about what it was like growing up with autism and having autism as an adult. There's even one book, she has photos of her brain scans, which is super neat to just show, like, scientifically, this is what's going on. I mentioned John Elder Robison. He talks about his experiences with that. So that would be kind of my first thing of encouragement for people is do your research. Try and figure out, like, okay, and I do think it's helpful to ask yourself, like, what do I think autism is? Within that, okay, then what do I have to unlearn? What do I need to relearn? And how can I be curious about people's experiences? Because it's going to be so different for every single person. And how can I connect with this person in an authentic way? Especially because a lot of times I've had conversations with people and they're like, I don't know if I've ever interacted with an autistic person. I'm like, you have. And so I can make that claim pretty definitively that autism is extremely common, and whether we realize it or not, whether it's friends, family members, coworkers, clients that we work with and support, there is probably someone that we've interacted with or currently interact with. And really and truly, that curiosity and trying to learn is a huge way to support somebody.
Do you think that there are a lot of people who have not been diagnosed? You were mentioning something about that earlier, where it's like likely we've been surrounded and interacting with people who are neurodivergent and identify as autistic, but like kind of what I was saying even before, like some people may not even know, or they would have like fear in a diagnosis potentially.
Absolutely. So yes, I think there's a lot of people who have not been diagnosed for a variety of reasons. If it's a child, there can be a lot of shame with parents about having a child who's, who was autistic. What did I do to my child? What did I do wrong? Could I have prevented this? There can be a lot of grief in that. I think for people, and sometimes people don't want a diagnosis. Sometimes and self-diagnosis can, for certain people, be a little bit of a hot topic. I live in the camp that if someone feels like a diagnosis is important to them, by all means, seek that out. And if someone's like, you know what, I'm not sure, and I think I have some spectrum-y traits, you do you. That's also okay. That feels very different than people who are like, I don't want to know, or I'm scared, or if I've got autism, it's only a little bit. I think there's a lot of complicated, nuanced things that can go into that.
Mm-hmm. I think just to follow up on something that you said before, even, when you were talking about high level or low level, I mean, that's something I definitely, as you were saying, that I'm like, man, I've heard that so much that it has been part of my language. And it's like, even hearing this right now, I'm like, oh geez, like it's so divisive and, unintentional, that there are just ways that it's been communicated about that I do think really ties in with the shame that people can be like, okay, well, if I identify as autistic, then I want to be on this end of the spectrum. And it's like, we have different ways of functioning. There are different needs that every individual has. It's not about, ranking yourself on, are you high end or low end,
Absolutely. And so much of that is language, again, that just societally we have to unlearn and just kind of notice it. And whenever you do hear it, if it's a situation where you feel safe and comfortable correcting it, correct it. Because you're right, everyone, whether you are autistic or not, we all operate and function in wildly different ways.
Yeah, which kind of takes me back to the last question that I asked you a little bit of doing your own work, looking at resources, kind of immersing yourself in some of the experiences that people with autism tend to have, which I love and I think is super key, that we should all definitely take advantage of these fantastic resources. I do love Love on the Spectrum.
It's so good.
It's so good. I still need to watch the second season, I think, but so good. And then also kind of what you were just saying as well, of like making sure that we're shifting our language as well, and like kind of going back to those fantastic questions you had mentioned about like asking yourself of like, what do I need to unlearn as well, and maybe relearn of like using different language, staying away from more stigmatizing and divisive language. I'm also thinking of like kind of a little more concrete type things, semi-ironically, of like what people can make sure to do to be a little more neuroaffirmative when interacting with folks with autism. And so just one thing that came to mind, and also from knowledge of clinical work from past colleagues as well, is just making sure you're being very literal, right? And less abstract, not using as many metaphors type of thing. Was that something that you'd suggest as well?
1,000%. I am so glad you brought that up. So autistic individuals can be, more often than not, literal thinkers. And so idioms can be really confusing. And we use them so often. I'm feeling blue. There's a frog in my throat. I can't think of anything else, right? It's raining cats and dogs. Different things like that. And those feel like old timey phrases. I don't know if people still say stuff like that, but it's like, those are things that come to mind. That can be really, really confusing, especially because it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? So yes, being direct and literal. And this is a little bit different, but makes me think of that. I read one time, I was reading something and I don't remember what it was, about what different people's experiences who are autistic, what it can be like. And someone was saying, when I look at a door, I see all of the aspects of it. I see a rectangle. I see the other little parts that might be on it. I see the knob, I see the screws that are in it, whereas someone who's neurotypical might just see a door. And so keeping that in mind, if someone's brain operates in the way that they are looking at all the details of what's going on, and you know, say a phrase like, oh, I'm feeling kind of down today, that can be like, okay, like, what does that mean? You know, try not to set someone up for them to have to read between the lines whenever social cues and social lines are already so confusing. Of course, having said that, I also want to be mindful of not talking to someone in a way that feels like you're being condescending. And so I feel like there can be a fine line with that of like, okay, let me be literal, let me be direct, and also let me talk to you just like another human I would interact with, because that's exactly what you are. And I think sometimes with the best of intentions, people can accidentally kind of like baby or talk to someone who's autistic in ways that they wouldn't interact with their other peers or friends or colleagues like that.
Yeah, great point. And again, another thing to unlearn, should that
Yes.
be a tendency to go towards that. I also really appreciate that in the example again that you gave, the great example of, you know, when your wife is singing along, don't change the song. And so I would imagine as the wife too, in that scenario, like maybe spelling it out a little bit more. I mean, honestly, as a couples therapist too, I feel like, again, neurotypical couples can do better with this too, of like, hey, I really like this song. When I'm singing along, that means I'm enjoying it. Like, let's enjoy it together maybe, or at least let me have this, like this pointing out kind of what indicators are of your mood to your partner type of thing. And I would imagine that would be that much more helpful in partnerships where there's at least one individual who is autistic as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then on that note, kind of if we're thinking about the broader systems of school and work, school places, even college, work systems, I know that's a really broad, really large kind of scenario. And so feel free to break it down however is helpful in your own brain, but just kind of thinking more like systemically in that way, what could help encourage more supportive environments for folks who are autistic in those settings?
No, that's such a good question. Gosh, I think right now I'm thinking of colleges specifically, and there are certain colleges. Texas Tech is one of them, and I believe one of the A&M sister schools, but I don't remember which one, have specific programs for autistic students to help them be successful in such a big transition. Of course, of all the colleges that might exist, of course, I'm only thinking of two off the top of my head. And so that's, it's like on one hand, like exciting that programs like that exist. On the other hand, it's disappointing that it's not as common. And so I think systemically for students that are going to college, whether it's, you know, finding a school that has supports like that, or if it's, you know, even looking for school, you know, schools, what are your disability services like? Are you known to have like a strong support system? And I think really encouraging students, encouraging parents, like to look for those resources. Again, there can be some shame in that of, well, I don't want to have these supports. And so it's really a lot of just kind of education around, like, you know, just even curiosity around it. Why not? What does it mean to you to have to need these supports? What, you know, can we at least be curious about it and see, like, the goal is to help you succeed and figure out, you know, hopefully the end goal is to not need their support. That would be pretty awesome. I think other systemic things that I'm thinking of, again, such specific examples, but like I've seen stickers on people's cars before, that says, you know, there might be someone in this car that's autistic, like for like emergency personnel. Because again, sometimes people who are autistic might have various sensory sensitivities. If, you know, a cop pulls you over, or there's something that happens in EMS, or the firefighters are called, all of the lights, all of the noise, that can be so overwhelming. And so if there's at least some kind of warning, is not the right word, but if there's some kind of like indication, hey, like, can you approach the situation, these people a little bit different, I think those are systemic changes that can also make a world of a difference too.
Yeah.
Even thinking, this is kind of going from broader down to like family systems, but that also makes me think, like, in family systems, I think, you know, of course, talking about parents, sometimes parents can feel grief and shame. And something also that should be considered is if there are siblings, if there are neurotypical siblings, there could be a lot of resentment there too. I'm tired of, you know, having to do this, or I can't do that. You know, I used to work with a family, and, you know, they had a child with autism, and then he had a younger sister, and the child with autism hated when his, like, and when I say hated, it's like he couldn't tolerate it. It wasn't like, oh, I dislike this. It was just, he had such a big physical reaction if her hair was pulled back in a hair tie. And so she would get so resentful. Why can't I wear my hair up? And so I think really giving space for that grief is also really important, because I think it helps with the, you know, on a family level, family system, it helps with that empathy. And then I think even then that can bleed out to broader societal systems.
Something that you just said too, of like space for that grief, and also maybe it's like space for compassion too, because as you're describing that, you know, whether that be in family relationships, coworker relationships, I mean, I think when the way that someone functions is different, and someone is having a hard time with that, like you just said with the sister and brother, like, I want to be able to wear my hair however I want to wear my hair. Now I could see how that could lead to the resentment being more of like this critical, like, I'm critical of this person because now that has an impact on me that's undesirable. And so I think it's almost like the cue of the people who are supporting individuals who are autistic is like, when you find that little kind of gut, like resentment or frustration with just the difference, to be able to say, like, this is an opportunity to be compassionate versus criticize that difference, to understand that, right? To like, that's the creating space. That sounds like, I mean, it's essential, really.
It really is. And it's like, and again, it's such a delicate balance. You are allowed to be frustrated. That sounds so hard. And then let's kind of like cue compassion, cue curiosity. What is it like? What are you needing? Like, how, like, at what point in time is it like, okay, like, let me validate this. Also, what do you know about autism? You know, what is this like for you? What curiosities do you have?
Yeah. I'm also thinking of, again, from clinical work previously with some families who had a child with autism, of both recognizing the needs of your child with autism, as well as the needs of the other children in the family, as well as your own needs too, because I think it can be so easy for the family to just kind of orient themselves entirely around the needs that autism demands so much, that so much can fall by the wayside so easily. And I know that it's hard for those families because there's often only so much capacity, but just another friendly reminder to plug in as well, that you kind of piggybacking off of what y'all said. And that also triggered another reminder too, of kind of, we had a recent podcast too with another one of our partners around neurodiversity, and really emphasizing the need for the environment to meet the needs of the individual and unique needs of individuals, including those who are neurodiverse. And so to me, kind of what you were talking about with like work and school and support systems, like people in those professions, like teachers, professors, like any helping profession, essentially if not all professions really,
Right.
but all just kind of making sure that they do their own work so they understand kind of what the needs can and might be of any people that they might be helping or supporting or working with or mentoring or working under, for that matter. And so but making sure that the environment, as much as possible, can be one that we can shift as much as we can to meet the needs of those people. And so it was kind of reminding me of when you're talking about the client that you had who like didn't want to need any of those things, like wishing that it can be reframed for that particular person too, of like, it's not about what you need, it's about the environment meeting your needs. Like, it's not the fact that you need something different, it's the fact that this environment is deserves to be what you need.
1,000%. And I think reframing it in that way is so, like, what a gift to give someone who's autistic, or anyone who has any kind of need that like the immediate environment doesn't meet their needs. Like, what a gift to just say, like, this is, we live in a world that is assuming that everyone who participates in these different experiences, all of their needs will be met, and one, that's just not realistic. Two, what can we do to shift it?
Majorly. Well, this is something you're touching on. I can't remember if we talked about this at the beginning of this call or if it was a different conversation, but you were saying that there's also an intersection with the queer community and autism. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm super curious.
Totally. So there's been research, and I'll be completely honest, I'm not up to date on like the research that has been conducted. And there's a lot of research about the intersecting identities of trans individuals and autistic individuals. And so that's something, and also, of course, like, just to, explicitly name it, just because someone's autistic does not mean that they are trans. Just because someone is trans does not mean they're autistic. And there could be a higher likelihood of those intersecting identities. And even just kind of something like a term that I learned fairly recently is gender vague, which is when someone's, gender nonconformity and their neurodiversity is intertwined. It's not really something that they can separate. And so just being aware of that. And I think especially for someone who's autistic and someone who is trans, it can really just like almost like being like, okay, I have these two identities. There's so much more about me. And how do I make space for these two marginalized identities? And what does that mean in like a neurotypical, assuming neurotypical heteronormative world, which can just be extremely vulnerable and challenging.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting to hear that too. And so that's a part of your work that I really like extra appreciate, because I know it's quality care can often be hard for these communities to find, whether you're autistic or part of the LGBTQ community, let alone both. And so I'm curious kind of what ways do you feel, or does your practice rather, like specifically words, what ways does your practice support the intersections of the clients that come to you who identify with both? And along those lines, sorry for adding two questions here, but I want to ask it before I forget it. What are some green flags that people both who identify as autistic and part of the LGBTQ community, or even questioning Q, but what are some green flags that they can look for in finding a therapist who can meet their needs?
Totally. So something that I do, and I share, I have both autism and working with people in the queer community listed as specialties on my website. And part of that is, I share my experience with that. So it's, I kind of greet people with, hey, I have this experience. And whenever I'm working with people, I think a huge thing that I want to share with them is, yes, you may have these identities, but what else is there? What else should I know about you? You're also a student or a partner or an artist or, fill in the blank. And really, because a lot of times, and then I'll tell people, like, if we spend our entire time talking about what it's like, being an autistic person, or you think that you might have autism, I am here for it. Let's talk about it. And if you're like, hey, this is me, and also I really want to talk to you about, something else, again, I always follow people's leads with that. And because I want people to know, like, this isn't all of you. Kind of, on those same lines, a lot of times, like, there can be like this want or this need to, like, pass for normal. Well, how can I fit in? And so again, just, I think, really making space at the client's pace to make space for that, because that's so exhausting. And again, so much grief intertwined with, like, what does it feel like not to feel normal? What is your definition of normal? And especially, I work a lot, I'm smiling because I'm thinking of a particular client. I work a lot with teenagers, and this one particular client, they will mention something, whether it's about their identity, and then when they've had enough, they change the subject so quick. It'll be talking about identity, like, oh, my dog did this, and I'm like, cool, let's talk about your dog. I do not question that. I don't try to circle back. And quite frankly, I'll do the same if I'm working with adults too, especially family work. If there's someone who has those intersecting identities, or one of the other, this is about the client. This is about what their needs are. And, like, as an adult, sometimes I struggle with saying, okay, I'm done. I'm at my limit. Let me talk about something else. And so I will always follow that lead. So kind of keeping that in mind with, like, green flags for people, when they're looking for someone in a helping and supportive profession to work with. It's, I think, one, is it a specialty of theirs? That feels kind of like a, maybe an obvious thing to say, but it's true. And if it is, you always have permission to ask, what makes this a specialty of yours? What is your experience? And just kind of having those questions. I think kind of on the opposite end of it, like, red flags and things to kind of, like, maybe, like, steer away from, again, people who use the functioning labels, or people who, I've heard different people say, like, oh, everyone's a little autistic. One, that's not true. Two, that's, again, so dismissive of people's actual experiences. So just really, like, paying attention to the language that people use. I think there can also be, gosh, I'm thinking of, like, again, you can even ask people, like, how important do you think diagnoses are? Or how important is it to you for you to, focus? How do you run your sessions? What if I need this? Or, like, I'm thinking also, again, Sapna, like you were saying, making the environment meet the needs of a person. It's like, okay, if we're meeting in person, I'm going to need some kind of sensory something, or I might, what are the lights like? How loud is it? Do you have sound machines? Some people might not be able to tolerate, there's so many things, of really just, like, kind of that curiosity of, like, okay, what are you going to be able to do to support me? I'm also thinking, and again, this is such a specific situation, and unfortunately, like, me being in Texas and the anti-trans legislation that's been happening here, is there was a parent that reached out to me, and they, was telling me, their child's autistic, am I comfortable with that? And after we, and we're talking, and before we actually set up an appointment, the parent was like, I need you to know my child is trans. Do you feel comfortable, given that we're in Texas, doing that? Which broke my heart. And also I understand where that parent's coming from. So again, I think really, particularly for people that are working with people who are autistic and trans, of just having that level of patience, of compassion, of whatever slowness that they need, because finding someone who's truly safe is, I mean, quite frankly, like right now, it's a gold mine. It's so hard to do that.
It just seems oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I also just kind of want to playfully like call myself out of like, here I'm talking about like, don't use idioms, and here I am, I just used one. And it's again how common it is in people's language.
Yeah, but I mean, even as you pointed that out, that's the awareness of the clinician, right? And I think that's what's really loud and clear as you're describing how you support your clients who either identify as autistic and or with trans identity too. And something that just strikes me is that it's like, you're not like, you are informed, but you're not in this, like, I'm assuming that each client that identifies in these ways needs this specific need, right? Like this is like, there's no like cookie cutter version of this. It's really getting to know the individual and letting them lead with their expertise and really following their lead and honoring that. But at the same time, going back to something, you brought this up and then you're reinforcing it in your work right now, Julie, of you're the person that's helping create this actual physical and emotional space that is that safe and comforting spot for them that, other people, if they're not informed, may just completely overlook that. So I just want to give you props too at the same time.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I half jokingly like say that, and if, like when I started working with autistic individuals, I like really and truly I kind of fell into it. And obviously 100 years later, it's something that I really enjoy, but I almost like jokingly name, I feel like people kind of have like, probably not appropriate to say, but like an autism face. Like they're like I think people are afraid of autism. I think they're afraid to support people, but I don't think, I think it comes from a lack of awareness, a lack of education. I don't think people actually are. I just think it just feels overwhelming, and there's so much information that someone's like, well, how do I actually do this? And I don't want to dismiss the education that I have, the work that I've done at all. And I do think there are so many supports and ways to learn that are quite frankly pretty easily accessible too.
Well, this might have been a perfect takeaway, but I wanted to just also ask, as we're kind of wrapping up here, is there anything else that we didn't talk about or touch on as much that you wanted to make sure to mention, and or any additional takeaways that you want to make sure to highlight as we end and make sure people walk away with?
Totally. I like have little notes of things that I've done with people previously. So I just want to go over that really quick. I did mention this already, but again, just kind of just saying, like, don't focus on the diagnosis itself. Like, what are the symptoms that exist within the diagnosis? I think that can be really helpful, because then that again is going to access what people's needs are. And another thing to think about, and again, this goes back to those social interactions that can be challenging in various ways. Sometimes autistic people have associative thinking, so they'll associate different things with a particular topic. So you ask about a plant, there's a plant right next to me. Ask about plants. Someone who's autistic might have associations about plants with who knows how many other stories. And as a result, in a conversation, might get wildly off topic. And again, I think it's about having the patience and curiosity and compassion for that. and kind of one, not shaming people when that happens, and two, kind of like following their lead while also being like, okay, I hear you, let's circle back. Let's do that, and kind of trying to like normalize kind of thinking like that.
That's especially good to point out, I think, because I mean, I'm just thinking about people I've supported within coworker relationships too, where just more of it's been a while since this conversation happened, but just someone managing their own impatience in those settings where it's like they're trying to manage their their direct report or however they would describe it, and it's like, well, if you have this information, like that one tip that you just shared of like follow their lead, and also give yourself permission to, once they've shared what they want to share, that is that association, then return back. And that's kind of how you learn to do this dance. But I definitely remember supporting someone with the impatience of like, that's yours to manage, it's not anyone else's. Like that's yours to also grow from too, of like, what's happening within me, like let's just follow their lead for a minute.
Totally. Which is easier said than done.
Yes.
I mean, in all of this, and even Sapna, you talking about like supporting, neurotypical, couples struggle with some of the things that we're talking about here. And so then just like, again, just naming like, it's not easy.
Right.
And that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, Julie, this was an amazing, enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your passion, your perspective, your experience. Super loved having this conversation with you and learning from you as well. And so how can people find you if they're interested in hearing more and or working with you?
Totally. So I'm pretty active on Instagram. So my Instagram handle is at Violet Crown Therapy. And then of course, just on my website, which is violetcrowntherapy.com. So, and I am always open to any questions, curiosities, all the things. And back to what you just said, also, I really appreciate having this conversation with y'all. This has been wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much. Y'all look her up. You're amazing, Julie. This has been so incredible for me. And I have so many notes here scribbled out, and also just like a couple of key quotes I feel like we really need to highlight. One I just want to say before we kind of close out is just symptoms over diagnosis. That feels really powerful for me, for many reasons, but specifically around the shame that I know that people can experience from what has been stigmatized so much. So that, and then also just the emphasis on patience and compassion and care, right? Of like, how are we all supporting one another? Because in the end of the day, we're all in this thing together. So thank you so much. Violet Crown Therapy, Julie. We can't wait to have another conversation with you down the line.
Same. Thank y'all so much.
Thanks, Julie.